The array had never been wrong. Not once, in 4,000 cycles of Vorkai expansion, had the great predictive mind failed to chart the future of a sapient species down to the week. It had told them when the Osirans would break under siege, and they broke on schedule. It had told them the Bren Collective would trade their fleet for peace rather than lose their capital, and they had. 61 species, 61 perfect models, 61 conquests that felt less like war and more like reading the last page of a book everyone already knew the ending to. So when Fleet Marshal Odreneves stood before the array's crystal display and watched it draw its long, confident line through the future of a small blue planet called Earth, she felt nothing resembling doubt. She felt the mild, pleasant boredom of watching a familiar machine do familiar work. "Run it again," she said, more out of habit than need. The array's light pulsed, considered, and confirmed. 99.8% certainty. Human civilization would resist for 11 months, fracture along economic lines by month 4, and formally capitulate by the second week of the 12th month, following the collapse of their largest coastal cities under blockade. The individual actors changed nothing. The model did not need names. It needed patterns, and humans, like every species before them, ran on patterns. Fear, hunger, the hoarding of resources, the search for someone to blame. "They're no different," said Vess's adjutant, a narrow, watchful officer named Threll. "None of them ever are." "No," Vess agreed. "They never are." She did not know yet that she was wrong. Nobody did. That was the nature of the mistake the array was about to make. It was not a small miscalculation buried in a footnote. It was a fracture running through the entire foundation of everything the Vorkai believed about the shape of intelligent life, and it would not announce itself with alarms. It would announce itself 11 months later with silence. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The invasion began the way the array said it would, and for a while that was almost worse than a surprise. Humanity's navies met the first wave exactly where predicted, fought exactly as long as predicted, and lost exactly as badly as predicted. News networks on Earth ran maps with red arrows creeping across oceans, and somewhere above the clouds, ships that had already computed those same arrows 6 months earlier watched the picture converge on their forecast with the patience of gardeners watching a seed do what seeds do. Selii was a strategist of the science cast, assigned not to any battle but to something quieter, the ongoing validation of the array's civilian model. Her job was to watch how ordinary humans behaved as the war tightened around them, and to confirm, city by city, family by family, that the predictions held. They did hold. For months, they held with an accuracy that bordered on eerie. Bread lines formed on schedule. Governments blamed each other on schedule. A father in a coastal town lost his factory job in the 3rd month, exactly as the economic model said someone in his income bracket, in his region with his profile would. Selii watched him through a low orbital feed with the mild professional interest of someone confirming a hypothesis she already believed. His name was Daniel Reyes. He had a daughter, 17, failing her final year of school because she'd stopped attending. He had a wife who worked 2 jobs to cover what his old one used to. The household strain index climbed steadily, matching the curve almost point for point. Selii logged it, filed it, moved on to the next household. There were 900 such households under her direct observation. All of them, in their own quiet ways, were falling apart on cue. This was the evidence base for the 11th month surrender. Fractured households did not resist. Fractured households wanted the fighting to stop so the hunger would stop. It had always worked this way. It was working this way now. Then, in the 9th month, something small happened that Selii almost didn't bother logging. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Vorkai had adopted a doctrine on worlds nearing collapse of what they called soft pacification, short, precise strikes on towns whose resistance had become symbolic rather than strategic, designed to demonstrate futility rather than inflict maximum damage. It was, in Vorkai terms, almost merciful. The strike on Daniel Reyes's town was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, time to coincide with an evacuation order that state authorities were expected to issue roughly 6 hours in advance. Enough time, the array calculated, for 81% of the population to reach the marked shelters. The evacuation order came late. A communications failure, unrelated to anything Vorkai had done, delayed it by nearly 3 hours. By the time sirens sounded, The safe window had narrowed to something under 90 minutes, and the roads out of town were already choking with cars. Celii watched the feed with the detached patience of someone who had watched 900 households do exactly what models predicted for 9 straight months. She expected panic, and she got it. She expected people to run for themselves, and mostly they did. The model accounted for that too, built entire subroutines around the statistical certainty that under existential threat, self-preservation would win out over communal obligation in a majority of individual actors, especially the ones already flagged as economically and psychologically strained. Daniel Reyes was flagged. Daniel Reyes was, according to 9 months of data, precisely the kind of actor the model expected to save himself first, if he had the chance at all. He had lost his job. He had lost, in small increments the model had tracked with real precision, his sense of being needed by anyone. The strain index on his household had been trending toward disengagement for weeks, the particular flavor of quiet withdrawal the array associated with actors who had, functionally, given up. He did not run. He put his wife and daughter in the car. He gave them the keys. And when his daughter, the same daughter who had stopped attending school, who barely spoke to him some nights, grabbed for his sleeve and screamed at him to get in, he told her something Celii's translation matrix rendered imperfectly as, "Someone has to hold the gate so the others get through, and it might as well be me." Then he walked back toward the center of town, where the evacuation route bottlenecked at a single bridge, and he began directing traffic. Not soldiers. Not authorities. A man with no training, no weapon, no strategic value the array's model could locate anywhere in its architecture, standing in the open with his arms raised, keeping 2 lanes of panic drivers from colliding with each other at the one crossing that mattered, for as long as it took. He was there when the strike came. Asterisk. Celii did not, at first, understand what she was looking at. She ran the incident back through her own local model, the smaller predictive tool every civilian analyst carried, expecting to find the error in her own instruments, a misread strain score, perhaps, or a household variable she'd logged incorrectly. The tool returned the same answer it always returned for a profile like his: probability of self-sacrificial action for non-kin adjacent, non-strategic benefit under 6%. His action fell outside that 6%. It fell, when she pushed the model to be more precise, into a category the tool did not have a name for, because the tool had never needed one. It was not irrational. The outcome, 63 additional people safely across the bridge before the strike, was measurable and real. But it was not optimized either. He had gained nothing. His wife and daughter would drive a few miles down a coastal road and never see him wave them off. There was no home left for him to return to. And some part of the model, some part of the whole architecture the array was built on, had assumed all along that every actor's choices ultimately resolved toward that actor's own survival or advantage, however delayed, however indirect. Daniel Reyes had chosen an outcome with no delayed advantage of any kind. He had chosen it anyway. Celii filed the incident, flagged as anomalous, single actor, and expected it to vanish into the enormous river of data the array processed every cycle. One strange grain of sand among trillions. It did not vanish. 3 weeks after the bridge, a Vorkai reconnaissance pilot named Soar Dathiz went down over farmland 80 kilometers inland, ejecting into a field his own targeting systems had flagged, correctly, as hostile territory. The array's threat model for downed personnel in that sector was blunt and, until then, reliable. Capture probability within 4 hours, 91%. Survival probability past 12 hours, under 10. Captured Vorkai pilots did not tend to live long on worlds fighting for their own survival. No prior campaign had shown otherwise. Resources were too scarce, and a captured enemy pilot was, by every calculation available to the people holding him, worth more dead as a symbol of resistance than alive as a bargaining chip nobody on the other side wanted to trade for. Dathiz was found within the hour, not by soldiers but by a farming militia, 11 armed and exhausted civilians who had, 3 days earlier, buried 2 of their own after an artillery exchange less than a mile from where he now lay. Every input the model had access to said this group, of all groups, should end him quickly and post the footage as a message to the rest of the fleet. That was, in fact, precisely what similar militias on other worlds had done, and precisely what Vorkai doctrine had long assumed civilian combatants would do under equivalent strain. Instead, after an argument that Celii later reconstructed from 3 separate intercepted radio channels, the militia's leader, a woman who had, according to the same channel, lost a brother to a Vorkai strike less than a week earlier, ordered that his fed, bandaged, and walked 11 kilometers to the nearest still-functioning field hospital, where he was handed over rather than harmed. When another militia member on the channel demanded to know why, her answer, translated imperfectly, came down to something like, "Because if we become what they are to get through this, there won't be anything left worth defending when it's over." Selly ran that exchange against every strain and cost-benefit variable in her instrument twice. Both times, the model returned the same range it had returned for Daniel Reyes, an outcome so far outside its confidence interval that it was, statistically speaking, indistinguishable from noise. Except it was not noise. It was Sorar dat his alive in a Vorkai medical bay 2 systems away, filing his own account of the incident, which Selly read 3 times before she understood that it was not an anomaly report at all. It was a warning nobody in the fleet yet knew how to read. 2 weeks after that, the Array's high command summoned every civilian model analyst on the fleet, and Selly understood, walking into that briefing, that Daniel Reyes was not the only strange grain of sand. He was, at best, the first of many the analysts had simply not yet connected to one another. *****. Fleet Marshal Vess had not slept in 2 days by the time she stood before the Array's display for the second time in the war, watching it try and fail to hold a straight line into humanity's future. The 11th month surrender had not happened. It was now month 14. The economic collapse the model predicted had, in fact, arrived almost exactly on schedule, but instead of producing the fractured, exhausted population that had submitted on 61 other worlds, it had produced something the Array's architecture had no clean vocabulary for. Actors with nothing left to lose were not behaving like actors with nothing left to lose. They were not hoarding. They were not, in the aggregate, turning on each other. Small, uncoordinated, statistically improbable acts. A bridge held, a convoy of strangers pooling fuel to get an elderly evacuee across a border. A captured Vorkai pilot released rather than executed by a militia that had every local incentive to do the opposite. Kept appearing in the data not as isolated anomalies but as a soft, persistent signal running underneath the collapse the model had correctly predicted. "Recalculate," Vess said. The Array recalculated. It widened its confidence intervals. It searched for a hidden variable, coordinated leadership, an unseen central authority organizing these acts, because a central authority was something the model knew how to weigh. It found none. The acts were not coordinated. Nobody had ordered Daniel Reyes to hold that bridge. Nobody had ordered the militia to release the pilot. There was no signal to trace back to a source because the source was not a signal. It was simply something a percentage of individual humans, under exactly the conditions the model said should break them, chose to do instead of breaking. "This is not a war-fighting variable," Threll said carefully, standing at Vess's shoulder. "It doesn't change the balance of forces. We still hold every strategic advantage." "It's not the balance of forces I'm worried about," Vess said. She was watching the Array's confidence figures instead, not the military projections which remained overwhelmingly favorable, but the deeper number underneath them, the one that measured how well the model's picture of human psychology matched observed reality. That number, which had sat above 98% for over a year, had begun, slowly and then not slowly, to fall. It was not falling because the model had gotten worse at predicting large groups under pressure. It was falling because the model had built its entire understanding of large groups under pressure on an assumption so basic nobody had ever thought to state it as an assumption at all. That a sufficiently threatened, sufficiently exhausted individual would, in the end, choose themselves. On 61 worlds, this had always been true enough of the time to make the aggregate math work. On Earth, it kept not being true in exactly the moments that mattered most, and the model had no mechanism for learning why, because the why lived somewhere the Array could not query, not in resource flows or fear thresholds, but in something humans apparently valued as an end in itself, independent of whether it helped them survive the week. *****. The turning point, when it came, did not arrive on a battlefield. It arrived in a small, unremarkable exchange between two governments that the Array had, with great confidence, predicted would never cooperate. A coastal alliance the model calculated would splinter under resource scarcity, spending their remaining leverage undercutting each other in a bid for individually better surrender terms. That was how it had gone on every world before. Desperation didn't unite people. It divided them because scarcity made every neighbor a competitor for the same shrinking resources, and the model had 1,000 conquered worlds worth of data confirming it. Instead, In month 16, three of Earth's largest remaining coastal states did something that broke the array's confidence interval so completely that HFY, watching the number happen in real time, thought at first her display had malfunctioned. They pooled what remained of their food and fuel reserves into a single shared authority, agreed in advance to divide losses equally rather than fight over what was left, and used the resulting stability to coordinate, for the first time in the war, a unified human resistance command. It should not have worked. Every incentive the model tracked said it should not have worked. The states involved had different governments, different languages, decades of prior friction, and, crucially, no strategic reason to trust one another once the crisis passed. The model had run the negotiation 11 separate times under slightly different starting conditions and returned the same answer every time. Collapse of talks within days, driven by each party's rational self-interest reasserting itself the moment real sacrifice was required. It did not collapse. HFY, cross-referencing the individual negotiators later, found something that felt, by then, uncomfortably familiar. Several of the human diplomats in that room had spent the war's first year watching people like Daniel Reyes hold bridges for strangers, had heard the stories, had, in language none of the array's models had a variable for, decided they wanted to be the kind of people those stories were about, and had let that decision outweigh the immediate math of self-interest. The array called it noise for a while. Then it called it an outlier cluster. Then, because the array was above all things honest with its own operators, it stopped calling it anything because it no longer had a category to put it in, and by month 18, Fleet Marshal Vess stood in front of her own command structure and said the sentence that no Vorkai officer had ever needed to say about any species in 4,000 cycles of expansion. We do not know what they will do next. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The war did not end in a single dramatic reversal. That was, HFY would later think, the most human thing about it. It simply stopped being winnable in the clean, computable way it had once seemed to be. The Vorkai still held overwhelming material advantage. They could still, on paper, grind Earth down through sheer attrition of ships and firepower. But every strategic model the fleet ran now carried, buried in its assumptions, the same flaw the array had inherited. It could not account for a population that, under pressure, sometimes chose cohesion and sacrifice not because those choices were optimal, but because enough individual humans had decided that being the kind of person who made that choice mattered more than winning. Attrition warfare against an enemy that predictable models say should fracture, and doesn't, is not the same war it looked like on the first day. Costs more. Takes longer. And every additional month it takes hands the initiative to political forces back on the Vorkai homeworld who had never liked the cost of this expansion in the first place, and who now had, for the first time in living memory, a number to point to, a war the array itself admitted it could no longer forecast with confidence. Fleet Marshal Vess was recalled in the 23rd month, not in disgrace, but in the quiet, procedural way that meant the same thing. Her replacement inherited a war that was, by every material measure, still winnable, and by every measure the array actually trusted, no longer predictable, and an unpredictable war, against an enemy with nothing left to gain from losing quietly, was a war the Vorkai Command Council had never had to fight before, on any of the 61 worlds that came before this one. HFY filed her final report from the Science-Cast Civilian Model Division 11 months after the day she'd first watched Daniel Reyes walk back toward a bridge instead of a car. She did not know, and would never know, what became of his daughter, or whether the strait he'd defended that morning had mattered in any way the war's larger arithmetic would ever register. That, she had come to understand, was not really the point of what she was writing. Her report did not recommend a change in tactics. It recommended something the array's architects had never had cause to consider before. A change in what the model was allowed to assume a person was for. Every prior model, on every prior world, had treated the individual as a small rational engine seeking its own advantage, and had been right often enough that the assumption felt less like a choice and more like a law of nature. Humanity had not disproven that engine existed. Daniel Reyes had almost certainly wanted to live. The negotiators in month 16 had almost certainly wanted to protect their own people first. But somewhere underneath that ordinary self-interest, in enough of them, often enough to matter, ran a second current the array had never been built to see. A willingness to spend everything on a value that had nothing to do with surviving the weak, simply because they had decided, individually and without instruction, that it was who they wanted to be. No warfighting doctrine could route around a variable like that, because it did not behave like a variable. It behaved like a choice that could appear anywhere, in anyone, at the exact moment the model needed it not to, and there was no data pattern that could tell you in advance which ordinary, exhausted, unremarkable person would be the one to make it. Celii closed her report with a single line that the science cast would argue over for years. Long after the war on Earth had ended in a stalemate no one on either side had predicted at its outset, and long after the array itself had been quietly rebuilt from its foundations to account for a possibility it had never once needed to model before. The line read, "We did not lose because we misjudged their strength. We lost because we assumed a person is only ever the sum of what helps them survive." Somewhere on a coastal road that no longer existed on any strategic map, that assumption had walked back toward a bridge instead of getting in the car, and the future the array had already written in perfect confident detail had simply stopped being true. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Years later, long after the ceasefire lines had hardened into something resembling a permanent border and the word Vorkai had entered human languages the way old invaders' names always eventually do. Flattened, half-forgotten, mostly a shorthand for a war people wanted to stop explaining to their children. A historian from the science cast's rebuilt civilian division traveled to Earth under a research visa neither side fully trusted, to see, in person, the place where the model had first broken. The town had been rebuilt around the bridge rather than away from it. There was a small marker at its near end, plain metal, a name and 2 dates and a handful of words in a language the historian had to run through translation twice to be sure she'd understood correctly. It said nothing about strategy or outcomes, or the war's eventual shape. It simply said that a man had stood there once and made it possible for others to cross, and that the town remembered him for it. The historian stood at the marker for a long time. She had read Celii's original report more times than she could count, had built her entire career on the question it left open, and had never, until that moment, understood it as anything other than data. Standing on the bridge, watching ordinary people cross it on their way to ordinary lives that a predictive engine of terrifying sophistication had once been certain would never happen, she finally understood what the report's final line had actually been trying to say. The array had not failed because it misunderstood a species. It had failed because it had tried to compute the average of 9 billion individual souls and had mistaken the average for the whole truth, when the whole truth, all along, had been waiting in the outliers, in the 6%, in the ones willing to become the exception the moment the model needed them not to. No engine built to predict what people would probably do could ever fully account for what a person, alone, deciding who they wanted to be, might choose instead. She left without taking a single measurement. Some things, she had finally come to understand, were never meant to be modeled at all.